Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Geography 341, Weather and Society, and the end of week one for our conventional semester here. This lecture is going to focus on a brief look at historical weather. I'm Dr. Zach Hilgendorf, as you have heard before. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. So weather throughout history, we have had a tumultuous history with weather. Has driven some incredible changes on our planet. When we were here, when we weren't. We've had some interesting weather-based experiences, from deities to droughts, floods to famine, and wars to witch trials, which we'll get into here in a second. But I just wanted to start off, there's not a ton of, we'll say, important things that are going to be built on for the rest of the class. This is really kind of just because I wanted to talk about how, from a societal standpoint, we've looked at weather and interpreted and experienced weather throughout our history. This isn't going to get into the nitty-gritty of how things like, temperature and thermometers were developed, or it's not going to get into how we grew to understand and model some of the things we do now. This is really more of a lighthearted, hopefully enjoyable video to look at some of the wild things that we've seen throughout our history. The content will come a little bit later once we're getting to some of those associated lectures. So let's start with deities. Just to kind of show, I think I've got 7 or 8 here from cultures across the world. Now, as I mentioned before, oftentimes when humanity doesn't know what something is, especially at a time when our understanding of scientific fact and theory were not as strongly rooted as they are today, the only way that you could handle a massive drought was to liken it to the fact that your deities, your pantheon of gods or your god, were pissed off at you. Which is kind of interesting because that was the way that people reckoned with these ideas that something is happening that they have no control over. So the way that they control it is by either praying to it, offering it sacrifice, offering it homage, whatever it was at the time. And it's not just one. We often think of, I don't think I have Thor in here, god of thunder, right? The Norse god of thunder. But it's not just the Germanic nations. It is every nation, every culture had basically had some homage to a weather god, which is fascinating if you really think about how these different cultures were really evolved and developed, and how all of them have similar kind of notions, whether it's a thunder god or a god of the wind or god of the rain. They all have something similar. Quetzalcoatl is one of the big ones that I think a lot of us have maybe heard of. This is an Aztec god. The name means precious serpent. Quetzalcoatl was the god of, or associated with the sun, the wind, the rain, the air, and learning, among many other things. One of the primary gods of the Aztec religion. And if you notice, these are the things that they're praying towards. If Quetzalcoatl was upset, maybe they were getting big storms. Maybe they were in a drought. Maybe the wind was blasting. These were ways that these societies, especially here in the Aztec example here, coped with and dealt with these types of events. Baba Mwana Raresa is a Zulu goddess. Most famously, and this is something I love, most famously, this goddess taught her people the art of making beer. So I will just briefly lift up my water bottle and show a dozen different stickers of beer, and one for our geography department. Awesome swag if you guys are interested. What a cool thing to be known for. But also the goddess of fertility, rainbows, agriculture, harvests, and rain. Think about it, a lot of these things are linked. With rain, at least decent, moderate rain, you'll have good harvest and good agricultural prospects. Rainbows are often associated with clear skies and positive things. And fertility, the earth, thinking of it from that perspective, a lot of times these gods of the harvest and gods of fertility, whether that be agricultural fertility or human fertility, were often linked. So I'll say it one more time so you can either laugh at me or be impressed if I actually got it right. But Mbaba Mwana Raresa was a really cool Zulu god. Definitely recommend looking more into that aspect of history within the Zulu people. Another super famous one, Horus, the Egyptian god, god of kingship, rainstorms, the weather explicitly, the sky, war, the sun, and retribution. This one covered a lot. Oftentimes personified via the pharaoh. The pharaoh was the basically god king or pharaoh, basically was a personification of the deities of the day. Horus, the kind of the hawk head, is very, very famous one. You see this on hieroglyphs and pottery all throughout the Egyptian time. And they had a pretty good understanding, the Egyptians did. They were definitely not a people who didn't understand things like geometry and the world around them. So think of things like the pyramids and the architectural requirements for building that. You could see that they were more advanced people. But things like rainstorms, the weather, the sky, the sun, all of these things go pretty well with things like retribution, if you think of it. Think about how you look at plagues and droughts, things like that they had to worry about. Oftentimes, these might be associated with Horus being displeased. Terranus is a Celtic god, a god of thunder. There are so many different gods of thunders. Terranus was one that I had not heard of before. I thought it would be cool to include them, especially because it's a Celtic god. I thought that was pretty interesting. So not too much that I was able to find on Terranus, but still thought it was pretty neat. And it wasn't Thor. Everyone knows Thor. Freyr, here's a Norse god for you. Again, the god of fertility and harvest and fair weather, sunshine. So notice all these things. They oftentimes very linked. So the god of fertility, peace, sacral kingship, prosperity, virility, sunshine, pleasure, fair weather, and the harvest. Freyr was associated with all of these things. So kind of, I think fair weather was the interesting one I found here, was if Freyr was pleased, weather was good. If Freyr was displeased, Freyr or somebody else was taking over. Okay, Eolus is not a god per se. Eolus is a mythological figure that was the ruler of the winds encountered by Odysseus in the Odyssey. And basically gave Odysseus a bag of the winds, except I believe the west wind, I think he withheld from him. And one of the sailors that was with Odysseus, I believe, if I remember how the myth goes, opened the bag and the winds sent them back to the island where Eolus was. And Eolus thought they were cursed by the gods and basically said, I'm not helping you, keep going on your journey. So Eolus, from a perspective of what I do a lot with looking about sand transport in dune systems or in rivers, but for the purposes of what I always liked learning about Eolus for, was the fact that, I have some friends who would always thank Eolus in their research papers for providing the wind that let us do our research. So just a silly inclusion. But moving on to our next one. Aside from Thor, probably the most obvious or most considered one is Zeus, the Greek god, king of the Greek pantheon, god of the sky, lightning, thunder, law, order, and justice. obviously famous in a lot of different mythologies and mythos and stories and pop culture references from the movie Hercules or things like that. But lightning, thunder, and the sky was his domain. That was one of the things he ruled over and used as his tools when they were fighting and warring and whatnot. So had to include Zeus. So. Indra, the Hindu god. This was kind of one of the, as far as I understand it, king of the Devas and Svarga. So kind of the head of the pantheon, much like Zeus was in Greek mythology. God of sky, lightning, weather, thunder, storms, rains, river flows, I love it, and war. So very interesting, especially if you think of where a lot of these religions were started and lived. These were things that you were worried about. The god of river flows, if you were in a drought and there was plenty of river flow, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of water for your crops and irrigation. So it could be a positive thing, but if Indra was upset, that could translate to flooding and devastation. So, like many of them, things like the sky, basically the atmosphere. If you think of it like that, Indra would be the god of the atmosphere, right? And maybe even the hydrosphere a little bit. But definitely one that I found interesting because trying to get into some of the Asian religions as well and kind of get some of those in. Yushi is a Chinese god of the rain. There's a bunch of brothers, if I remember right, for Yushi, and this is just one of them. They didn't expound upon it too much, but it's carrying two snakes and is the god of the rain. So I wish I had more to go on there. Fujin is a Japanese god, the god of the winds, who carries a large bag of winds on his shoulder. That bag that you see here, let's see, drawing it out here, that is full of the winds. And if Fujin was not happy, you could expect that winds would be devastating or drastic or dramatic. If Fujin was pleased, it wouldn't be. Fujin also had brothers and others in the pantheon who were things like god of the rain, so the thunder gods that I didn't include because I already had a few of those here. So, oh man, okay. I loved this one. This is a Maori god. Taviri Ma'ate. Taviri Ma'atea. Taviri Ma'atea. There we go. I included that, and I knew I was digging my own grave here of mispronunciation. But this one was really cool. The god of weather, thunder, lightning, winds, clouds, and storms. And Taviri Ma'atea waged war against his brothers using an army of his children. All were different types of wind. Now, if you think of things like the Maori culture, things like sailing and migration from island to island were very important. As such, wind was so important because if you were getting a bad wind and you were trying to sail, holy crap, you were in trouble. So Taviri Ma'atea was, I thought, a really cool one. There was no actual depiction of them, but still, I was pretty stoked to see this one. I thought it was a really cool inclusion. Okay, moving into wild weather. So these next 5 slides are really just, or no, 4. I've got 4 different stories for a reason of weather and weird things that have happened that have really changed society. The first of them being drought leading to the first recorded bubonic plague. For those of you unfamiliar with the term bubonic plague, I'd be surprised. The Black Death, the plague that ravaged most of the civilized world, especially Europe, in the 500s to much later, I think through the like 700s or so. So this was a period of extreme droughts and colder temperatures in Africa during the 530s. Lack of rain destroyed crops, depleted the population of rodents that fed on the crops. This lack of rodents led to issues further up the food web, so predators were being starved. And if you know anything about ecology, you'll have that dip in the predator, but then things like rodents reproduce much, much faster. Their time until they can, they're of reproductive age is much shorter. So what you saw was a massive influx of rodents rebounding first and returning in greater numbers than they had been before. What that led to was an influx that infested East Africa and found their way aboard merchant ships. 50 million deaths and 2 centuries of recurrence later, the Bubonic Plague, or the Black Death, was one of the most impactful things to ravage Europe. And you still see some architecture and influences of the Black Death throughout Europe today. So I thought that was a pretty fascinating one. A mini ice age is thought to have led to the Salem witch trials for a tangential region, but we'll see here. So this happened. So in the there's a mini ice age, we'll call it, a very large dip in temperatures that happened in the medieval time period here. So this happened in about 1692 to 93. The event, a theory contends, and this is I think a doctoral candidate at Harvard at the time, contends that because people thought witches could control the weather, the prevalence of the 400-year Little Ice Age that existed from the 1500s to 1800s led to an uptick in associated witchcraft accusations. The coldest of those periods came between 1680 and 1730. There are diaries and sermons from this time that suggest that bad weather was helping to inspire allegations of witchcraft within Salem. Over 200 people were accused and 20 people were put to death. So fascinating relationship between, what was going on, the belief and accusations of witchcraft, and what was really happening at the time from a meteorological perspective. So I thought that was a pretty interesting one. We can thank fog for the majority of our country. Year 1776, an upcoming attack by the British was thwarted by the movement of American forces across the East River to Manhattan under the cover of a very dense fog. There was only a couple hundred meters separating these two armies. Historians widely agree that George Washington would have been captured and hung for treason, and the army completely overrun without that fog. So at the time, the general of the revolution would have been hung and our armies would have been overrun. So we can almost thank America for some really dense fog, which is kind of fascinating. A bit more of a sad one here. Cold temperatures led to the Challenger disasters. The year was 1986. A crew of 7 aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger were killed after an O-ring malfunction caused by record low temperatures. Unfortunately, documentation shows recommendations against launching in temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The launch occurred at 26 degrees Fahrenheit. And they went against the recommendations, and as a result, the disaster as the Challenger was launching. So interesting there. But that leads to our first random assignment. Random assignment number 1, you're going to read through the article provided on the random assignment 1 link in Canvas. That'll be under the week 1 module. You're going to pick one of the events that I have not talked about. So the Bubonic Plague, the witchcraft one, the fog, and the Challenger shuttle. So there are a ton of others. There's like 33 pages of these events. you're going to write a 300-word write-up by the due date I have listed on Canvas, not Campus. And you have to include one external source. So you're going to have to, I want you to learn more about this and the theories about it. So you're going to go a little bit more in depth, and I have all of that highlighted and described on the Canvas assignment module for this. There's also a rubric included as well. So, it's a quick recap. Weather is weird, wild, and wondrous. This course will explore how we understand and interpret weather. It'll build more on the historical and societal capacities as we go on. But for now, that's where I'm going to leave you. So I hope you enjoyed the material for this week. We'll see you next week or in the next session for more. So enjoy and have a great day. Thank you.